You are useless. My daughter hissed those words across the dining room table, her eyes blazing with absolute disgust. Tears immediately pricked my vision, but I bit my lip and forced them back. She looked at me and saw nothing but a failing, clumsy old woman. She had absolutely no idea about the agonizing secret tearing me apart from the inside. She did not know that just 3 hours earlier, I had permanently destroyed my entire future and my only chance at true happiness just to save her life. I am Barbara. I am 65 years old. For 35 long years, I worked as a dedicated bookkeeper. I sat in a cramped, windowless office under harsh fluorescent lights crunching numbers day in and day out. I sacrificed every personal luxury, every vacation, every new piece of clothing so my only daughter Chloe could have the perfect suburban American dream. I wanted her to have the beautiful house, the prestigious college education, the flawless life I never got to experience. But right now, in the middle of her immaculate dining room, surrounded by luxury, none of that mattered. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I was trying to serve the roasted turkey to her husband Greg and his wealthy real estate partners. The heavy porcelain gravy boat slipped from my trembling fingers. It crashed against the expensive hardwood floor, shattering into 100 sharp pieces. Dark brown gravy splattered everywhere, soaking the edges of Chloe's designer silk dress and staining the pristine rug. The entire room went dead silent. The clinking of crystal wine glasses stopped instantly. The polite dinner laughter faded into a suffocating, uncomfortable quiet. Chloe slammed her hands flat on the table and stood up, pushing her chair back violently. You are useless. She screamed, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the house I helped them furnish. I cannot believe you ruined this dinner. These are Greg's most important partners, and you cannot even carry a simple dish without causing a disaster. I stood there frozen with the eyes of 6 strangers judging my humiliation. My chest physically ached, as if someone had placed a heavy stone directly over my heart. I wanted to scream the truth. I wanted to shake her and tell her exactly why my hands were failing me today. I was not trembling from old age or clumsiness. I was trembling from sheer absolute shock. Just 3 hours before this elegant dinner party, I was sitting in a sterile federal building making the most devastating decision of my entire existence. But I kept my mouth tightly shut. I lowered my head and stared at the terrible mess on the floor, swallowing the heavy lump of grief forming in my throat. I dropped to my knees on the cold wood floor and began gathering the broken shards of porcelain with my bare hands. As the sharp edges cut into my aging skin, my mind violently pulled me back to the stark reality of my afternoon. I had received a terrifying phone call that morning, pulling me into a highly private meeting at the IRS field office downtown. A serious federal agent laid out a massive mountain of paperwork on a cold steel table, showing me the horrifying truth. Greg, the flashy and supposedly highly successful real estate developer Chloe married, had committed massive federal tax fraud. He had deliberately set up a complex web of illegal shell companies in Delaware and routed hundreds of thousands of dollars offshore to dodge taxes. But the most sinister part, the detail that literally took my breath away, was that he had forged Chloe's signature on every single official document. She was legally listed as the primary director of these fraudulent entities. The agent looked me dead in the eye and told me Chloe was facing imminent federal indictment and up to 10 years in federal prison. I could not let my daughter go to prison. I simply could not allow the child I raised to be locked away in a cell because of her husband's greed. So I made a desperate deal. I begged the federal agent for a non-prosecution agreement if the debt was paid in full immediately. To cover the massive $500,000 penalty, I liquidated absolutely everything I owned. I drained my pristine retirement portfolio that took me almost 40 years of blood, sweat, and tears to build. Worse than that, I sold the beautiful, quiet lake house I was supposed to move into next month with my fiancé Thomas. Thomas was a kind, gentle man who finally showed me what true, unconditional love felt like in my golden years. But to protect him from the incoming scandal and the devastating financial ruin I was bringing upon myself, I had to push him away forever. I met him at a local coffee shop right after the IRS meeting. I broke our engagement without giving him a real explanation, telling him I just could not go through with the wedding. I watched the heart break in his kind eyes as I stood up and walked away, leaving my own happiness dead on the floor. A sharp piece of porcelain suddenly sliced deep into my thumb, bringing me forcefully back to the dining room. A bright drop of my blood mixed with the spilled gravy on the wood. I looked up from the floor, fighting the tears. Greg was sitting comfortably at the head of the table, swirling his expensive red wine. He looked down at me with a smirk of pure cold satisfaction. He knew exactly what he was doing. "Let the old lady clean it up, Chloe," he said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "Do not help her. It is the absolute least she can do since she lives here rent-free." After I surrendered every single penny I had to save Chloe from federal prison, I was left with absolutely nothing. I had no home, no retirement portfolio, and no future with the man I loved. Greg graciously offered me the small, damp room down in their finished basement. To the outside world, he played the role of the ultimate benevolent son-in-law. He would stand around at neighborhood barbecues holding a craft beer and loudly brag to anyone who would listen about his incredible charity. He loved telling his wealthy golf buddies that he took in his destitute mother-in-law when she had absolutely nowhere else to go. I had to bite my tongue and force a smile while he painted himself as a generous saint. Meanwhile, behind their heavy mahogany doors, my daily reality was an endless series of calculated humiliations. Greg absolutely refused to let me park my reliable 10-year-old sedan in their massive circular driveway. He claimed my vehicle was an absolute eyesore that brought down the neighborhood property value. Instead, I had to park 3 blocks away on a public street where my car was constantly exposed to the harsh weather and occasional parking tickets. The pristine driveway was strictly reserved for his 2 luxury sports cars and Chloe's expensive imported SUV. Chloe started working from home around that time, but she never seemed to have a single free moment. Every morning I would wake up to find a long, detailed list of physical chores taped to the kitchen counter. I was expected to perfectly iron Greg's custom-tailored suits, wash all the massive living room windows, and literally scrub the master bathroom grout on my hands and knees with a tiny bristle brush. My lower back ached constantly and my arthritis flared up in my hands, but I did the heavy work silently, because I truly believed I was helping my daughter build a stable life. Then the disrespect escalated into something much more sinister and terrifying. One Tuesday afternoon, I politely asked Greg if he had seen a missing piece of my personal mail. I was simply waiting for a standard summary from my old bank just to close out a final zero balance account. Greg immediately snatched the opportunity to completely undermine me. He looked across the kitchen at Chloe, let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, and tapped his temple with his index finger. He told my daughter that my mind was really going and that I was becoming dangerously forgetful. He said they needed to start restricting my access to things around the house before I hurt myself or lost something important. I stood there completely stunned as he smoothly and confidently convinced my daughter that I was losing my grip on reality simply because I asked a basic question about my own mail. It was a deliberate, calculated move to make me look foolish and incompetent in front of my own child. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I realized he was testing his new power over me. That deliberate campaign to strip away my dignity reached a breaking point during one of Greg's lavish dinner parties. He had invited a group of highly influential real estate investors over to celebrate a major new development project. Hours before the guests were scheduled to arrive, Greg walked into the kitchen and tossed a plain black uniform apron onto the counter right in front of me. He looked me up and down with an expression of pure disdain and told me to put it on. He explicitly instructed me not to speak to any of his wealthy investors unless I was spoken to first. He wanted me to blend into the background and act exclusively as their personal serving staff for the entire evening. I was completely mortified. I was a 65-year-old retired professional woman, being ordered to play the role of a silent servant in front of absolute strangers. But I tied the black apron around my waist and spent the next 6 hours carrying heavy trays of hot food, refilling crystal wine glasses, and clearing away dirty plates while the men laughed and boasted about their massive financial victories. My feet were throbbing with sharp shooting pains and my chest felt incredibly tight from the sheer exhaustion of the night. When the main course was finally cleared away, I managed to catch my daughter alone in the hallway near the kitchen pantry. I pulled Chloe aside, hoping to find just a tiny shred of sympathy from the child I had given up everything to protect. I gently touched her arm and dropped a quiet hint about how exhausted I was. I told her my legs were shaking and I simply needed to sit down for just 5 minutes before serving the dessert courses. Chloe did not offer me a warm hug or a chair. Instead, she crossed her arms tightly over her chest and rolled her eyes with profound annoyance. She looked at me with a coldness that shattered my heart into a million pieces. She told me that Greg was providing a beautiful roof over my head and that I needed to stop being so incredibly ungrateful. She said I was embarrassing her by complaining about doing a few simple favors for the man who was keeping me off the streets. In that terrible, agonizing moment, a horrifying realization washed over me. My daughter was not just turning a blind eye to her husband's cruelty. She was completely participating in it. She truly believed I was a useless burden who owed them my endless labor just to justify my existence in their basement. I stared at Chloe's angry, defensive face and realized with absolute terror that she was completely under Greg's toxic psychological control. He had completely rewritten her reality and turned my beautiful daughter against the mother who had destroyed her own future just to guarantee hers. I took a slow, shaky breath and walked back into the dining room to serve the dessert in silence. It was past midnight when I finally carried my cleaning supplies into Greg's sprawling home office. The house was completely silent. My body ached from a punishing day of physical labor, but the chores never ended. Greg demanded his office be spotless every single morning. As I wiped down his massive oak desk, my dusting cloth brushed against a thick stack of papers he had carelessly left out in the open. I was about to neatly stack them when my eyes caught the top page. It was a commercial bank statement. I had spent 35 years as a professional bookkeeper. I spent my entire career staring at ledgers, finding discrepancies and balancing accounts. My brain recognized the financial patterns long before I consciously realized what I was looking at. The numbers on that statement immediately jumped out at me as massive, glaring anomalies. There were huge outward cash flows routed to names I did not recognize. I put down my duster and picked up the paper. My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I flipped to the second page and then the third. It was a detailed ledger of wire transfers. Greg was moving enormous sums of money out of their joint domestic accounts and funneling them into strange corporate entities. I saw 3 different shell companies officially registered in Delaware. From those Delaware accounts, the money was being instantly swept into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. These were not the normal business transactions of a legitimate real estate developer. These were the highly calculated movements of someone rapidly hiding liquid assets. My hands began to shake, but my professional instincts completely took over. I pulled my old cell phone out of my apron pocket and opened the camera. I took sharp, clear photos of every single page of the bank statement. Then I noticed a second folder underneath the first containing corporate registration documents. I photographed those too, capturing the names of the managing directors and the exact dates the offshore accounts were opened. I was so intensely focused on capturing the evidence that I completely failed to hear the heavy footsteps marching down the hallway. The brass doorknob turned with a sharp metallic click. Pure terror flooded my veins. Greg was walking into the office. Moving with the desperate speed of a terrified animal, I shoved the ledgers back into their exact original position. I dropped my phone into my deep apron pocket and grabbed the vacuum cleaner hose from the floor. As Greg pushed the heavy door open, I dropped to my knees and began vigorously scrubbing the vacuum attachment along the wooden baseboards. He stood in the doorway, glaring at me with dark, suspicious eyes. "What are you doing in here so late?" he demanded, his voice thick with anger. I kept my head down, pretending to struggle with a stubborn smudge on the trim. "Just finishing my chores," I replied, forcing my voice to sound tired and submissive. He stepped into the room, and his eyes darted immediately to the stack of papers on his desk. He walked over, snatched the folders up, and locked them inside his briefcase. "Do not ever touch my desk," he snapped, kicking the vacuum hose out of his way. "Finish up and get out." He marched out of the room, leaving me trembling on the floor, but possessing the exact evidence I needed. I rushed down the stairs to my damp basement room and locked the flimsy door behind me. I sat on my lumpy mattress, shivering from the cold draft, and pulled out my phone. I zoomed in on the glowing screen, carefully analyzing the photographs I had just taken. In the safety of my isolated room, I began to connect the dark, terrifying dots. The dates on the Delaware Shell Company registrations aligned perfectly with the timeline of the previous federal tax fraud. The horrifying realization hit me like a runaway freight train. The $500,000 debt I had paid off to the IRS to save my daughter was not an unfortunate mistake. Greg had not simply been careless with his accounting. He had deliberately and systematically framed Chloe to take the fall for his massive money laundering scheme. He used her trusting signature to shield himself completely. And now, looking at the newest transfer dates, I realized he was actively preparing to do it all over again, but this time for a much larger sum. I scrolled through the final batch of photos I had snapped from the second folder. They were printed emails between Greg and a prominent divorce attorney. The subject lines were incredibly cold and calculating. Greg was mapping out a ruthless exit strategy. He outlined his explicit plan to entirely drain Chloe's remaining personal assets, including the equity in her home and her private savings. Once the accounts were completely empty, he planned to file for a sudden aggressive divorce. The emails detailed how he would legally leave Chloe holding the bag for the brand new round of federal fraud he was currently committing. He was setting her up to face the catastrophic federal charges alone while he walked away clean with millions in untraceable offshore funds. My stomach violently turned. The sheer evil of his plan was almost impossible to process. He was not just stealing from his wife. He was planning to utterly destroy her entire existence and leave her to rot in a federal prison. I had sacrificed my own future, my financial security, and the only good man who ever loved me just to keep Chloe safe. I thought my sacrifice had bought her a second chance at a happy life. Instead, it merely bought Greg more time to construct a far more devastating trap. He had taken my money, laughed at my foolish desperation, and immediately went back to using my child as his human shield. I sat in the freezing basement staring at the concrete walls as a profound, chilling clarity washed over me. I could no longer simply play the role of the submissive, beaten-down maid. Greg believed he held all the power because he thought I was just a useless, broken old woman. He thought I was completely blind to his schemes. But he severely underestimated the sharp, meticulous mind of a mother who had spent her entire life balancing ledgers and protecting her only child. The crippling sadness that had weighed me down for months suddenly evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a cold, burning determination. I wiped the final tear from my cheek and locked my phone. I was going to stop this monster. The next morning arrived with a cold dampness that seemed to seep straight into my bones. I was up long before the sun, dragging a heavy bag of trash out to the garage, just as Greg demanded I do every single day. The heavy concrete floor chilled my bare feet through my thin slippers, but I ignored the discomfort. My mind was completely focused on the terrifying financial ledgers I had discovered the night before. As I quietly pushed the heavy side door open, I heard a voice echoing through the cavernous space. It was Greg. He was leaning against the hood of his expensive sports car, holding his phone close to his face. He thought he was completely alone. I froze in the shadows behind a stack of moving boxes, holding my breath so tightly my lungs began to burn. His voice was not the sharp, aggressive bark he used with me, or the fake supportive tone he used with Chloe. It was a smooth, affectionate purr. He was talking to a woman, and her name was Tiffany. I pressed my back flat against the cold brick wall, pulling my old cell phone from my apron pocket. My hands were trembling violently, but I managed to open the voice memo application and press the red record button. What I captured in the next 3 minutes was a masterclass in pure, unadulterated evil. Greg let out a low, arrogant laugh that echoed off the garage walls. He told Tiffany not to worry about the money, because draining my accounts had been the easiest thing he had ever done. I stood there listening to him brag about how he manipulated my desperate love for my daughter to wipe out my entire life savings. But his absolute cruelty did not stop there. He lowered his voice into a conspiratorial whisper and outlined a plan that made the blood freeze solid in my veins. He told Tiffany that the final phase was already in motion. He explicitly stated that once he manipulated Chloe into signing a full power of attorney over me, they would take whatever small scraps of dignity I had left. His exact words were that they would dump the old lady in a miserable state-run ward where no one would ever listen to my complaints. Then he promised Tiffany he would immediately file for a sudden aggressive divorce. He bragged that he was going to leave Chloe completely drowning in the new round of federal fraud debt while they flew off to the Cayman Islands by Christmas. He called my daughter a clueless human shield. I stopped the recording and clutched the phone to my chest. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal was staggering. He was not just stealing from us. He was orchestrating the total systematic annihilation of our entire family. He planned to leave his own wife to rot in a federal prison while I wasted away in a psychiatric ward. I backed out of the garage, moving like a silent ghost, but my soul was roaring with a protective maternal fury. I waited until Greg left for his golf club before I finally approached my daughter. Chloe was sitting in the kitchen sipping a freshly brewed latte and typing rapidly on her expensive laptop. My heart ached just looking at her. Despite everything, she was still my little girl. She was still the child I had sacrificed my entire life to protect. I walked over and sat down across from her, keeping my voice as incredibly soft and calm as possible. I did not mention the horrifying recording or the secret offshore accounts yet. I knew I had to tread extremely carefully because she was deeply entrenched in Greg's psychological control. I reached out and gently touched her arm, asking her if she had looked at her joint bank accounts lately. I suggested that maybe she should log in and just verify that their finances were secure. I hoped that seeing the missing funds with her own eyes would break the spell. Instead, Chloe violently yanked her arm away, as if my touch had physically burned her. She slammed her laptop shut with a loud crack that made me jump. Her face twisted into a mask of pure defensive rage. She leaned across the kitchen island and glared at me with absolute contempt. "Greg warned me you were getting paranoid." She spat, her voice dripping with venom. "He told me your mind was deteriorating and you were making up crazy delusional stories to cause trouble." I sat there completely stunned as my own flesh and blood weaponized my desperate concern against me. I tried to speak to beg her to just look at the numbers, but she cut me off completely. "You are just jealous," she yelled, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "You are jealous because Greg is a highly successful man who provides for his family and you ended up with absolutely nothing. You ruined your own life, and now you want to ruin mine because you cannot stand seeing me happy." Those cruel, devastating words tore right through my chest. She told me I ended up with absolutely nothing. The irony was so incredibly bitter it almost choked me. I had nothing because I had willingly surrendered every single penny to save her from federal indictment. I had given up the love of a wonderful man to keep her out of a prison cell, and she was defending the very monster who had orchestrated the entire nightmare. I looked into Chloe's angry, defensive eyes and realized a terrifying truth. My daughter was entirely gone. She had allowed Greg to completely brainwash her, turning her against the only person in the world who genuinely loved her. My heart physically broke in that immaculate kitchen, but as the pieces shattered, my endless willingness to suffer in silence died completely. I stood up and walked away without saying another word. I knew I could no longer simply protect her from the shadows. I was going to have to let her world burn down so I could expose the devil standing right beside her. The very next morning, I knew instantly that Greg had sensed something was terribly off in his immaculate office. Maybe I had left the vacuum cleaner hose a single inch too far to the left. Or perhaps he could simply smell the lingering fear I had left behind in the room. He did not confront me directly with loud anger or physical violence. Instead, he initiated a quiet and terrifying psychological war deliberately designed to completely destroy my mind and credibility. It started with small, baffling things that made me question my own memory. I woke up at dawn to take my daily heart medication and found my weekly plastic pill organizer completely empty. I knew with absolute certainty I had carefully filled it on Sunday afternoon, but Greg stood right beside Chloe in the kitchen, wrapping his thick arm protectively around her shoulder and sadly shaking his head. He told my daughter in a hushed, worried voice that I was rapidly forgetting to take my vital pills and absent-mindedly throwing them away in the kitchen trash. I tried to protest, but the empty plastic container sat on the granite counter as silent, damning proof of his lie. The very next day, my heavy ring of car keys vanished from the brass hook by the front door. I spent 4 agonizing hours frantically searching the basement on my hands and knees, while Greg watched me from the top of the stairs with a cold, dead stare. The ultimate betrayal came 2 days after the missing keys. I went upstairs to make a simple pot of afternoon tea. The electric stove simply would not turn on. I pulled the heavy appliance slightly away from the wall and saw the thick black cord had been completely yanked out of the socket. Before I could even reach down to plug it back in, Greg marched into the kitchen with Chloe right behind him. He pointed aggressively at the unplugged stove and loudly claimed he had been forced to disconnect it because he caught me leaving the hot burners on high while I aimlessly wandered around the house. He looked my daughter dead in the eye and told her I was becoming a severe and immediate danger to the entire household. Chloe gasped loudly and covered her mouth, staring at me like I was a ticking time bomb about to explode. I tried to defend myself, but my voice shook with pure indignation, making me look exactly as unstable and frantic as he claimed I was. To make absolutely sure I could not reach out for outside help, he systematically cut me off from the rest of the world. The wireless internet connection down in the basement mysteriously stopped working, leaving my old phone completely dead and useless. When I tried to walk up to the garage to leave the house on foot, I found his 2 massive sports cars parked horizontally across the wide driveway. They were locked tight, forming a solid metal barricade that completely blocked my old sedan and the exit. I was a prisoner in the very home I had sacrificed everything to save. I sat on my cold basement bed, clutching my chest, feeling absolutely trapped and entirely helpless as the concrete walls slowly closed in around me. The psychological torture was just the careful preparation for his ultimate strike. Later that same week, Greg staged a horrifying and inescapable ambush. I was quietly folding laundry in the dim basement when I heard heavy footsteps marching down the wooden stairs. Greg walked into my damp room, followed by a tall, gaunt man carrying a worn leather briefcase. Greg introduced this total stranger to Chloe and me as a highly respected medical colleague who had graciously agreed to do a quick in-home wellness check. The man did not wear a traditional white coat, and his eyes darted around the room like a cornered thief. I smelled his cheap, overpowering cologne and knew instantly this man was no legitimate physician. He was a hired actor, a shady, unlicensed con artist paid handsomely to seal my tragic fate. He sat me down forcefully on the edge of my bed and began speaking to me in an incredibly slow, patronizing tone, exactly like I was a confused toddler. He asked me aggressively insulting cognitive questions. He held up 3 fingers right in my face and demanded I count them aloud. He asked me to name the current president and told me to spell the word window backward. Every single time I answered him perfectly clearly and correctly, he simply sighed, shook his head heavily, and scribbled something dark on his yellow legal pad. Chloe stood in the doorway, wringing her hands with intense worry, completely buying into the elaborate theatrical performance. I felt a hot flash of pure rage and flatly refused to answer his final demeaning question, demanding he leave my room immediately. The fake doctor stood up, adjusted his cheap tie, and turned to my daughter with a deeply grave and mournful expression. He pulled a thick, pre-written document from his leather briefcase and handed it directly to Greg. He announced in a heavy, serious voice that these were the preliminary findings of severe advancing dementia. He told Chloe that I lacked the basic mental capacity to care for myself and required immediate legal and medical intervention. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as I watched my own daughter absorb this manufactured tragedy. She began to cry softly, leaning her head against Greg's chest, seeking comfort from the very devil destroying us. But over her shaking shoulder, Greg locked his dark eyes entirely on me. A slow, sinister smirk crawled across his face. He mouthed the words, "You are done," perfectly silently, so only I could see. The message was absolute and terrifying. He had successfully laid the legal groundwork to strip away my freedom and take complete control of my life. The clock on my nightstand flashed 3 in the morning. The entire house above me was dead silent. I sat on the edge of my lumpy mattress, fully dressed in my warmest sweater and sturdy walking shoes. Greg had successfully blocked my car and disconnected the internet, but his sheer arrogance made him careless. He had completely forgotten about the small rusted hopper window, hidden behind the massive basement washing machines. It was a tight squeeze, but it was my only way out. I unzipped a small canvas duffel bag and carefully packed my entire life into it. I packed my original Social Security card, my birth certificate, and the stamped federal receipt proving I had paid off Chloe's massive IRS debt. Most importantly, I packed my cell phone wrapped securely in a plastic bag. That phone held the photographs of Greg's offshore bank ledgers and the crystal-clear audio recording of him plotting to steal my life and abandon my daughter. I climbed on top of the cold metal washing machine and pushed the heavy glass window open. The freezing night air hit my face like a physical blow. It took every ounce of strength I had left in my aging bones to pull my body up and squeeze through the narrow concrete opening. I tumbled out into the wet grass, scraping my knees, but I did not stop to rest. I grabbed my bag and began to walk. I walked 3 grueling miles in the biting cold through silent suburban streets and dark, empty intersections. My lungs burned and my arthritis screamed with every single step, but the sheer burning fury in my chest kept me moving forward. Just before 5 in the morning, I finally saw the bright, buzzing neon sign of a 24-hour diner out on the main highway. I pushed through the glass doors, shivering uncontrollably, and slid into a back booth. I ordered a black coffee and pulled a crumpled business card from the bottom of my purse. It belonged to attorney Arthur Davis, a ruthless, brilliant lawyer who specialized in elder exploitation and severe financial fraud. I had found his name weeks ago in a local library brochure, but never dared to call. Now I had no other choice. I dialed his emergency answering service and left a desperate, detailed message. Less than an hour later, as the sun began to peek over the horizon, Davis walked through the diner doors. He was a sharp, imposing man who did not waste time on pleasantries. I slid my phone across the sticky laminate table and showed him the photographs of the Delaware shell companies. I played the recording of Greg laughing with his mistress about committing me to a state ward. Davis sat back in his vinyl booth, completely stunned by the sheer depth and absolute clarity of the evidence I had managed to gather right under Greg's nose. Davis immediately understood the severe gravity of the situation. He did not just take me back to a standard law office. He drove us directly to a secure private conference room in a downtown federal building. By 9 in the morning, he had brought in a highly skilled forensic accountant and a seasoned FBI agent who specialized entirely in complex wire fraud. I sat at a massive mahogany table drinking a glass of water as the federal agent meticulously reviewed the digital photographs on my phone. The agent looked up at me with profound respect and a heavy sigh. He revealed that Greg was already on a highly restricted federal watch list for suspicious real estate transactions. The Bureau knew he was moving dirty money, but they simply could not find the internal paper trail to prove it. Greg was too careful with his corporate electronics and shredded all physical evidence. The photos I had taken in the middle of the night showing the exact offshore account numbers and the corresponding shell companies were the ultimate smoking gun they had been desperately searching for. But the wire fraud was only one piece of the puzzle. Davis leaned forward and explained that to put Greg away for maximum time and to completely protect my assets, we needed to catch him dead to rights on the attempted elder exploitation. We needed rock-solid proof that he was actively trying to forge my signature and illegally transfer my remaining funds before having me forcibly committed. Davis looked me straight in the eye and delivered the hardest strategy imaginable. He told me I could not run away just yet. If I stayed hidden, Greg would simply claim I was a wandering, confused dementia patient who had run away in the middle of the night. He would use my disappearance to expedite the conservatorship and seize control of everything immediately. I had to go back to that house. I had to willingly walk right back into the lion's den and pretend that his psychological warfare was actually working. Davis instructed me to play the part of a broken, defeated, and profoundly confused old woman. I had to lower Greg's defenses completely and make him so arrogant that he would make one final sloppy mistake. I had to let him set his trap so we could catch him in the absolute act of presenting the fraudulent commitment papers and the forged asset transfers. My stomach twisted with sheer nausea at the thought of facing Greg and Chloe again. I knew looking into my daughter's eyes while she blindly helped a monster destroy me would take a terrible toll on my heart. But I tightened my grip on the edge of the conference table and nodded my head. I agreed to return to the basement. I was ready to play my part, and I was ready for war. I walked back up the long, winding driveway to the house just as the morning sun broke over the manicured lawns. My clothes were damp with cold dew and my hair was intentionally disheveled. I shuffled my feet, dragging my heavy walking shoes against the expensive paving stones. I let my shoulders slump forward and fixed a vacant, lost expression on my face. The front door swung open violently before I even reached the porch steps. Greg stood there in his silk bathrobe holding a cup of coffee. He did not look relieved to see me. He looked intensely annoyed. Chloe rushed out from behind him, grabbing my arm with a harsh grip. She dragged me inside, demanding to know where I had been all night. I blinked at her, slowly, acting as though I could not quite recognize my own daughter. I mumbled something about trying to find the grocery store to buy milk for breakfast. Chloe let out a loud, exasperated sigh and turned to Greg. She told him he was absolutely right and that my mind was completely gone. Greg just smirked over his coffee mug. He wrapped a comforting arm around Chloe and whispered loudly that it was a tragedy, but they had to face reality. He claimed my midnight wandering was the final, undeniable proof of my severe dementia. I kept my face totally blank while inside my blood boiled with a sharp, focused rage. I shuffled past them toward my basement stairs, playing the part of the broken, defeated burden they desperately wanted me to be. My fake surrender worked perfectly. Greg immediately let his guard down. He was a deeply arrogant man, and my performance thoroughly convinced him that he had completely won the war. He believed I was just a senile old woman with absolutely zero capacity to stop him. That sheer arrogance made him incredibly sloppy. Later that same afternoon, he returned from a meeting and tossed his expensive leather briefcase right onto the kitchen island. He did not lock the golden clasps. He just left it sitting wide open while he walked out to the patio to take a personal phone call. My heart slammed against my ribs. I grabbed my cleaning rag to maintain my cover and quietly moved to the island. I peeked inside the open leather bag. Sticking right out of a manila folder were the final fraudulent asset transfer documents. I quickly pulled my phone from my pocket and snapped crystal-clear photographs of every single page. The documents detailed the exact offshore routing numbers he planned to use once he drained the last of my hidden emergency funds. I slid the papers back perfectly into place and resumed wiping the granite counter just seconds before he strolled back inside. He grabbed his briefcase without a single second thought, totally unaware that I had just secured the final nail in his federal coffin. The true depth of my agony was not realizing Greg was a monster. I already knew that fact. The ultimate heartbreak was watching my own flesh and blood completely surrender to his evil. That evening the house was incredibly quiet. I stood hidden in the dark hallway just outside the main living room, completely out of sight. The heavy shadows concealed me as I watched Greg and Chloe sitting closely together on the expensive white leather sofa. Greg pulled a thick stack of legal papers from his newly locked briefcase and placed them gently on the glass coffee table. He used his softest, most manipulative voice. He told Chloe that my mental decline was accelerating much faster than anyone could have anticipated. He painted a terrifying picture of me wandering into traffic or accidentally burning the house down. He told her they needed to take immediate emergency conservatorship over me. He framed the entire legal maneuver as an act of profound charity and familial duty. He lied smoothly, claiming the paperwork would simply allow them to protect my few remaining assets and secure a safe, comfortable room for me in a specialized psychiatric facility. I held my breath, pressing my trembling hand against the cold hallway wall. I desperately prayed that Chloe would stop and read the documents. I prayed she would see the fine print giving Greg total unrestricted access to liquidate every single account associated with my name. I begged the universe to let my daughter ask just one critical question or demand to speak with an independent lawyer. But Chloe did not read a single word of the fine print. She did not even glance at the second page. She simply nodded her head, wiping a dramatic tear from her cheek. She completely bought into his twisted narrative that she was performing an act of mercy by locking her mother away in a state ward. Greg handed her a sleek silver pen. The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was the soft scratching of ink against heavy paper. I watched from the shadows as my daughter signed my freedom away. She signed the power of attorney. She signed the medical commitment authorization. She handed the heavy burden of my entire existence directly to a man who planned to destroy us both. The betrayal was absolute and crushing. It felt like a physical blow to my chest, driving the remaining breath from my lungs. The child I had carried, nourished, and sacrificed everything for had just legally authorized my total destruction without a second of hesitation. Greg took the papers back and placed them in his briefcase. He pulled Chloe into a warm embrace, gently stroking her hair. Over her shoulder, his dark eyes stared blankly at the wall right near my hiding spot. A chilling, satisfied smile spread across his face. He finally had everything he needed. But standing in that dark hallway, watching my daughter betray me, I realized I no longer felt any hesitation. My blind maternal devotion died right there on that living room sofa. The trap was perfectly set, and I was entirely ready to pull the trigger. Thanksgiving weekend arrived with a bitter, freezing chill in the air. But inside the massive house, the atmosphere was suffocatingly warm and loud. Greg had carefully orchestrated a massive, extravagant dinner party. This was not a cozy, intimate family holiday gathering. He had explicitly invited his wealthiest real estate partners, local politicians, and all of Chloe's deeply pretentious in-laws. The sprawling, formal living room was filled with the sharp clinking of expensive crystal and the loud, booming laughter of men who thought they owned the world. The rich, savory scent of roasted turkey and warm autumn spices drifted from the gourmet kitchen, but I felt absolutely no appetite. I knew exactly why Greg had organized this lavish public event. He desperately needed an audience. He planned to use this festive gathering to publicly announce my tragic and unfortunate mental decline. He was going to confirm my impending move to a specialized medical facility to cement his role as the ultimate long-suffering hero. I sat quietly in a velvet armchair in the corner of the room, wearing a simple gray dress and tightly holding a glass of ice water. I watched him work the crowded room. He was putting on the absolute performance of a lifetime. He moved gracefully from group to group, holding a glass of expensive bourbon and leaning in close to whisper in their ears. I could clearly see him cast sorrowful, tragic glances in my direction. I watched him shake his head heavily and dramatically pat his chest right over his heart, as if he were carrying the terrible weight of the world on his broad shoulders. The reaction from the wealthy guests was immediate and completely sickening. Women draped in heavy diamonds looked at me with deep, pitying stares. Men offered Greg sympathetic, firm pats on the back, loudly praising him for being such a wonderfully devoted son-in-law. Chloe stood right by his side, playing the role of the exhausted, heartbroken daughter to absolute perfection. She graciously accepted the comforting hugs from her wealthy friends, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was actively preparing to abandon her to ruthless federal investigators. Sitting silently in that corner, I felt the heavy, crushing weight of their collective judgment. They looked at me and saw a hollow, broken woman who was rapidly losing her mind. They saw a tragic, pathetic burden who needed to be locked away for her own good. My hands gripped the cold glass so tightly, my aging knuckles turned completely white. It took every single ounce of restraint I possessed not to stand up and scream the absolute truth right in their faces. I had to endure this final agonizing humiliation. I had to let Greg feel entirely invincible. I watched the heavy brass clock on the mantel slowly ticking away the agonizing minutes, while the noise of the party grew steadily louder. Greg was basking in the glowing warmth of their blind admiration, entirely unaware that his perfect financial empire was built on a crumbling foundation of gasoline, and I was standing there quietly holding the only match. Just before the catering staff announced that dinner was formally served, Greg caught my eye from across the crowded room. His sympathetic mask vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by a cold, hard glare. He gave a sharp, subtle jerk of his head toward the kitchen doors. I took a slow, trembling breath and carefully set my water glass down on the side table. I pushed myself up from the armchair and shuffled slowly through the sea of guests, keeping my head bowed in a posture of complete defeat. As soon as the heavy swinging doors of the kitchen closed behind me, the loud, cheerful noise of the party was instantly muffled. Greg was waiting for me near the large marble island. He was no longer playing the role of the kind, benevolent provider. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick folded stack of legal papers. He slammed the commitment documents down onto the hard marble counter with a violent crack that made me physically jump. He pulled a sleek metal pen from his pocket and threw it down right next to the papers. He stepped into my personal space, invading my boundaries, until I could smell the sharp alcohol on his breath. His dark eyes bored directly into my soul. He told me I was going to sign the final asset transfer right now, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying rumble. He swore that if I refused him, he would have me thrown into a state-run psychiatric ward the very next morning. He promised to make sure they placed me in the absolute worst facility in the entire state. He explicitly threatened that they would strap me to a medical bed and chemically restrain me until I did not even remember my own name. I tried to back away, pretending to be paralyzed by sheer terror, but he grabbed my upper arm with a bruising, painful grip, pulling me forcefully back to the counter. He whispered that I could not stop him, while a cruel, victorious smile stretched across his face. He reminded me that Chloe had already signed the emergency power of attorney. He gloated that my own daughter had given him the absolute legal right to lock me away forever. He said Chloe believed I was a danger to myself, but we both knew the truth. He called me a pathetic old woman who tried to play a dangerous game she could not possibly win. He ordered me to pick up the pen and sign the papers before he walked back out to the party and told all his wealthy guests that I was having a violent delusional episode. I looked down at the fraudulent documents, feeling the cold marble beneath my shaking hands. I let a single hot tear roll down my cheek, playing the part of the utterly broken victim. He released my arm, confident that he had completely broken my spirit. He stood there towering over me, eagerly waiting for my ultimate surrender. I slowly reached out my trembling fingers and picked up the heavy metal pen, knowing that this isolated kitchen cornering was his absolute final mistake, and my ultimate victory was finally about to begin. I looked down at the heavy metal pen resting on the cold marble counter. Greg stood over me, breathing heavily with that sickening smirk of absolute victory plastered across his face. He expected me to cry. He expected me to completely surrender and sign my entire life away just like he had planned for months. But instead of picking up the pen, I slowly lifted my head. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. I straightened my back, pushing my shoulders back and pulling myself up to my full height. The pathetic, confused old woman he thought he had broken disappeared in a single second. I looked Greg dead in the eye and saw his smug smile suddenly falter. A flash of genuine confusion crossed his face. I reached out and snatched the fraudulent commitment papers right off the counter, clutching them firmly in my hand. I did not say a single word to him in that kitchen. I simply turned around and walked right past him, moving with a fierce, undeniable purpose. I pushed through the heavy wooden swinging doors and marched directly into the massive dining room. The room was packed with his wealthy real estate partners, their wives and Chloe's pretentious in-laws. The long mahogany table was overflowing with expensive wine and roasted turkey, but my sudden entrance made a few heads turn. I ignored their pitying glances. I walked straight to the head of the table, where a beautiful crystal goblet sat perfectly placed. I grabbed a heavy silver spoon and tapped it sharply against the glass. The high, clear chime rang out, cutting through the loud conversations and the soft background music. The entire room fell silent. 130 eyes turned to look at me, The grand dining room was completely hushed. Suddenly, the kitchen doors burst open behind me. Greg rushed into the room, his face flushed red with sudden panic. He hurried toward me, waving his hands frantically at the guests, trying to salvage his carefully constructed narrative. He forced a painfully sympathetic smile and raised his voice so everyone could hear. He told everyone to please excuse Barbara because she was just having a severe episode right now, and that they were going to get her back upstairs to rest. His voice was dripping with that fake sugary concern he had perfected over the last few months. But I yanked my arm away from him with such violent force that he actually stumbled backward. I turned to face the crowded room holding the fraudulent papers high in the air. I told them I was perfectly lucid, my voice ringing with absolute clarity and unshakable power. I said I was not having an episode, and I was not losing my mind. I looked directly at the wealthy guests who had been giving me pitying looks all evening. I told them it was time everyone in this room knew exactly who was paying for this extravagant dinner. A collective gasp rippled through the elegant dining room. The wealthy real estate investors and the perfectly dressed in-laws stared at me in stunned silence. Greg took another desperate step toward me, reaching out to snatch the papers from my hand. He hissed under his breath, telling me to shut my mouth before I ruined everything. But I was miles ahead of him. I pulled my cell phone from my apron pocket. I had already secretly paired the device to the expensive wireless Bluetooth speaker system Greg had installed in the living room ceiling. I did not hesitate for a single second. I pressed the play button on my screen and turned the volume all the way up to the absolute maximum limit. The high-definition speakers crackled to life, and suddenly Greg's own voice echoed loudly through the entire house. It was not his professional business voice, and it was not his fake loving husband voice. It was the cruel, arrogant voice from the garage. The recording played with crystal clear precision. Everyone in the room heard Greg laughing with his mistress Tiffany. They heard him explicitly bragging about how incredibly easy it was to drain my life savings by manipulating my desperate love for my daughter. The guests stood frozen in absolute horror as the recording continued. Greg's booming recorded voice echoed off the high ceilings, outlining his master plan. He laughed about forcing Chloe to sign a power of attorney so they could dump the crazy old lady in a miserable state-run psychiatric ward. Then came the absolute worst part. The audio captured him promising Tiffany that he would immediately file for divorce, leaving his clueless human shield of a wife drowning in federal fraud debt while they flew off to the Cayman Islands by Christmas. I stopped the recording, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I looked at Greg. The arrogant monster who had tormented me for months was completely gone. His face had turned completely chalk white. The blood had entirely drained from his cheeks, and he was sweating profusely. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no words came out. His wealthy partners looked at him with sheer absolute disgust, stepping away from him as if he were carrying a deadly disease. Then I heard a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. A delicate crystal wine glass slipped from Chloe's trembling fingers and shattered violently against the hardwood floor. I turned to look at my daughter. She was staring at her husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Her eyes were wide and her mouth was slightly open in a silent scream. The perfect, flawless reality she thought she was living had just been completely incinerated in front of all her friends and family. The man she had defended, the man she had chosen over her own mother, had just been exposed as a ruthless predator. She looked from Greg to me, and the crushing weight of her absolute betrayal finally brought her to her knees in the middle of the shattered glass. Chloe stood there shivering amidst the sparkling shards of broken glass on the dining room floor. Her eyes were completely wide with shock as she stared at the man she thought she knew. Her voice trembled violently when she finally turned away from Greg and looked directly at me. "Mom, what is this?" she stammered, her face pale and streaked with tears. "What does that recording mean?" I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out the thick manila envelope I had carried with me all night. I walked slowly across the silent room and handed the heavy stack of papers directly to my daughter. I told her to look at the documents. I watched her hands shake as she pulled out the stamped federal tax receipt and the official bank transfer records. Her eyes scanned the numbers, and I could see the exact moment the devastating reality crashed down upon her. "You called me useless, Chloe," I said, my voice steady and echoing through the hushed room. "You treated me like a common maid in my own home. You let this man convince you that I was losing my mind and becoming a burden to your perfect life." I pointed to the federal receipt in her trembling hands. "But that piece of paper you are holding is the $500,000 I paid entirely in cash just 3 months ago. I paid it to keep you out of a federal prison cell because your wonderful husband used your social security number and your identity to launder his dirty real estate money." A loud collective gasp swept through the wealthy guests standing around the room. Greg tried to open his mouth to deny it, but he was completely paralyzed by fear. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my daughter. "I gave up my beloved fiancé," I said, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. "I drained my entire retirement fund and surrendered the home I worked my whole life to build, just to save you from a federal indictment you did not even know was coming. I suffered his abuse in absolute silence because he threatened to turn you over to the authorities if I spoke a single word." I reminded her of the countless times I had begged her to look at their joint bank accounts and the times she had violently yanked her arm away and called me jealous of her success. I told her that while she was busy defending a monster, I was secretly meeting with tax lawyers to keep her name off the federal indictments. I sacrificed my own dignity and allowed myself to be treated like absolute garbage just so she could keep living her comfortable illusion. "I gave up my entire world to protect you, Chloe, and you repaid my ultimate sacrifice by happily signing my freedom away without even bothering to read the fine print." Chloe collapsed to her knees, weeping uncontrollably as the sheer magnitude of her blind betrayal finally became undeniable. She clung to my skirt, begging for my forgiveness, but the damage was already done. The illusion of her perfect marriage was entirely shattered, leaving nothing but the ugly, devastating truth. Greg finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He realized the wealthy investors he needed to impress were now staring at him with absolute contempt. His grand plan was completely ruined, and he knew his offshore accounts were fully exposed. He spun around wildly, looking for an escape route. He bolted toward the heavy glass patio doors at the back of the house, hoping to disappear into the dark yard, but before his hand could even touch the brass handle, the heavy front doorbell rang out with a sharp, echoing chime. The loud sound froze him in his tracks. The heavy oak front door swung open, and Attorney Davis marched confidently into the grand foyer. He was not alone. Flanked closely behind him were 2 towering federal agents in dark suits and 3 local police officers in full uniform. The authoritative presence of the law enforcement officers instantly silenced the remaining whispers in the room. Davis spotted me across the dining room and gave a firm, respectful nod before turning his steely gaze directly onto Greg. He pointed a steady finger at my son-in-law and announced to the entire room that the performance was officially over. The 2 federal agents moved swiftly across the expensive hardwood floor, closing the distance before Greg could even take another step. One of the agents grabbed Greg's arms and forcefully twisted them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoed loudly, cutting through the tense air of the dining room. The lead agent recited Greg's Miranda rights in a loud, booming voice, declaring that he was officially under federal arrest for severe wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable elder. Greg struggled weakly against their tight grip, but his previous arrogance was completely obliterated. He was sweating profusely, and his face was twisted in an ugly mask of pure panic. He begged his wealthy real estate partners for help, crying out that it was all a massive misunderstanding and that he could explain everything. But the investors simply turned their backs in absolute disgust, refusing to even look at the pathetic criminal standing before them. The local police officers stepped forward to secure the perimeter, while the federal agents marched Greg right through the center of the party. The man who had spent months meticulously planning my total destruction was now being dragged out of his own lavish home in absolute disgrace. I stood tall and firm, holding my head high as I watched the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminate the large front windows. The heavy front door slammed shut behind him, taking the dark, suffocating cloud of his evil entirely out of my life. I looked down at Chloe, who was still weeping softly on the floor. I knew our relationship would require a massive amount of healing, but for the very first time in years, I finally felt completely safe and entirely free. If you liked my story, please subscribe to Her Golden Years Stories so I can bring you more incredible life lessons. The red and blue lights of the police cars slowly faded down the long street, taking Greg away forever. The massive house emptied out incredibly fast. The wealthy real estate partners and the pretentious in-laws practically ran for the doors, desperate to distance themselves from the scandalous federal arrest. Within 10 minutes, the grand dining room was entirely silent except for the sound of my daughter weeping. Chloe knelt on the hardwood floor, surrounded by the shattered pieces of her perfect illusion. Her expensive dress was wrinkled and her face was stained with dark streaks of ruined makeup. She looked up at me with eyes so full of desperate sorrow that it physically ached to see her. "Mom!" She choked out, her voice trembling so violently she could barely speak. "Mom! I am so sorry. I did not know. I swear I did not read the papers. I just trusted him. I thought he was trying to help you." She crawled toward me and wrapped her arms around my knees, burying her face in my gray skirt. She begged me to forgive her, sobbing uncontrollably as she finally realized the absolute magnitude of what she had nearly done to her own mother. She had willingly handed me over to a monster who planned to lock me in a psychiatric ward and drug me into a stupor while he stole the very money I paid to keep her out of a federal prison cell. I stood there looking down at my only child. For 45 years, my immediate instinct had always been to drop to the floor, hold her tight, and promise her that I would magically fix every single mistake she made. I had spent my entire life shielding her from the harsh consequences of her own actions. But as I looked at the broken glass scattered around us, I knew that shielding her was exactly what had allowed Greg to turn her against me. I gently but firmly placed my hands on her shoulders and stepped back, forcing her to look up at me. "I forgive you, Chloe," I said, my voice steady and echoing clearly in the empty room. "I will always love you because you are my daughter. But I will not save you again." I watched the shock register on her tear-stained face. I told her she was a grown woman who had chosen blind greed and a fake, luxurious lifestyle over the mother who gave up everything for her. I explained that I had sacrificed my retirement, my home, and the man I loved to pay her federal debts. I told her she needed to learn how to clean up her own messes and finally learn to stand firmly on her own 2 feet. I turned around and walked out the heavy front door, carrying only my small canvas duffel bag, leaving her alone in the massive house to face the devastating reality she had allowed to happen. I walked down the long driveway without looking back, even once, breathing in the crisp night air and feeling the heavy chains of guilt completely fall away from my tired shoulders. 6 months later, the world looked entirely different. I was sitting at a small round table in a beautiful coastal cafe, listening to the soothing sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore. The warm morning sun bathed my face, and a gentle, salty breeze ruffled my hair. I took a slow, peaceful sip of my black coffee, feeling a deep sense of absolute freedom. Attorney Davis had been completely relentless in federal court. With the crystal-clear evidence I had provided, the federal agents easily seized all of Greg's hidden offshore accounts. Davis successfully negotiated the complete return of my stolen funds. I got every single penny of my $500,000 back, while Greg was securely locked away, awaiting a very long federal prison sentence. Chloe was forced to sell the massive house to pay off the remaining debts Greg left behind, and she was currently renting a tiny apartment while working 2 jobs to support herself. She called me once a week, and our conversations were brief, but they were finally built on genuine respect instead of entitlement. As I looked out at the sparkling blue water, the little bell above the cafe door chimed cheerfully. I turned around and my heart skipped a beat. Thomas walked through the door looking just as handsome and kind as the day I walked away from him. After the federal trial ended, I had finally found the courage to call him and explain the terrible truth. I told him how I had pushed him away to secretly pay off my daughter's federal tax debts, and how I was too ashamed to let him carry my heavy burdens. Thomas did not judge me. He simply told me he had never stopped loving me, and that he was willing to wait until I was ready. He understood the monumental sacrifice I had made, and he respected the fierce battle I had fought to reclaim my independence. He walked over to my table with a warm, radiant smile and took my hands in his, making me feel truly cherished for the first time in years. Sitting there with a good, honest man, I realized the most profound truth of my entire life. True love as a parent does not mean letting your children completely destroy your dignity. Sometimes the absolute greatest act of maternal love is walking away and letting them learn how to survive on their own. I had to hit rock bottom and lose my entire world to find my real strength, but I finally found my peace. If you liked my story, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment below to let me know what you would have done in my place. Your support helps me share more incredible life lessons. Thank you for listening, and remember that it is never too late to reclaim your power and write a beautiful new ending to your own story.